With highly contagious respiratory illnesses spreading rapidly, we're experiencing what many are calling a tripledemic, the three illnesses being COVID-19, flu, and RSV. The rise in these illnesses could mean a challenging holiday season for many. So today we've brought back Christiana Care's Chief Infection Prevention Officer, Dr. Marcy Drees, to discuss the current state of the tripledemic and how we can all protect ourselves and each other this holiday season. Dr. Drees, thanks so much for taking the time for us today.
Yes, thank you, Megan, for inviting me and welcome everyone.
So I just want to remind everyone, if you're watching us live, please submit those questions in the comments and we will get to them throughout our conversation. If you're catching us after the live has wrapped, please continue to submit those questions in the comments and we can certainly chat in the comments well after this live has wrapped. So Dr. Drees, let's get started with an overview. We're tracking the numbers for COVID, we're tracking flu, we're tracking RSV. What is a general overview of what all of this looks like right now?
Well, basically that everything's out there, right? So, since the pandemic started, COVID is kind of dominated. And whenever COVID was dominating, the other respiratory viruses really weren't around. And then once COVID started to wane, they would come up. So really atypical RSV and flu seasons the last couple of years. So this is really the first year that we're seeing increases in all three of them pretty much at the same time. And it's mostly RSV and flu, to be honest. COVID is still there, certainly, and is pretty steady. We're maybe starting to see a slight incline or increase in flu or in COVID now, but all three of them are definitely circulating. Plus, we have a lot of rhinovirus, which is the typical kind of common cold virus that's out there. So there's just tons of respiratory viruses out there right now.
So, you mentioned rhinovirus. How is this season different than, say, 2018, 2019, some of those pre-COVID cold and flu seasons?
Well, I mean, I think, we typically see a lot of cold, rhinovirus type colds in the fall and into the winter. They tend to be mild, even in people that have underlying conditions. You don't typically get fevers, but it's just, you feel miserable for a week or so. And then, flu season typically, at least in this part of the world, tends to start to increase late November, early December, and then often peaks late December, January. So this year we saw a very, very early flu season with really more flu in October and November than we typically ever see. And that's been reflected, in the Southern Hemisphere this past year, that they just had a very early flu season. Similarly, our RSV tends to peak in the winter. So very, very early impact of RSV as well. So everything's just kind of out of season, and it's hard to know how much of that is, behavior changes and, people not being exposed to some of these viruses for the last couple of years because of all the masking and schools being closed and everything else. But it's kind of messed everything up in terms of predictability.
So yeah, I was going to ask, why do you think this is all happening right now? Especially we're 2 weeks out from Thanksgiving. Do you think that, that is as a correlation to how many people are, not feeling well watching this right now?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly RSV peaked first, and maybe I think it's probably peaked and is starting to come down, although it's still very, very high. Flu certainly was picking up well before Thanksgiving. And so I think a lot of it is, the winter was coming, people are indoors more, your activities are more likely to be indoors than in the summertime. And so there's just a lot more close personal contact than people have in the summertime. There's also some evidence that suggests like the immune cells in our nose just don't work as well when it's cold out, which is kind of interesting. So I think there's just a lot of combination, people, and then, again, people aren't masking indoors like they were maybe a year ago. So I think it's just a combination of all that stuff.
So, speaking of masking, the CDC director just a few days ago said, quote, "One need not wait on CDC action to put a mask on." What is your recommendation for those wondering, do I need to put it back on in the grocery store or at a Christmas party? I haven't worn it, since last winter, potentially.
Yeah, no, I think, obviously our thinking on masks has evolved. We went from mandating masks everywhere, even outdoors, to like, okay, we probably don't need it outdoors, but they're still mandated indoors. Obviously, every state handled it a little bit differently. It's come down to, obviously it's a politically difficult thing to do to mandate masking in this day and age. So I think it's come down to a lot of personal responsibility, which is unfortunate because it does leave people exposed that maybe can't protect themselves quite as well. But, and around COVID, the CDC, a year or more ago had set different community levels where people and different guidance based on what community level. So if your community is green, you maybe don't need to mask. If it's yellow, if you're at higher risk, you probably do want a mask. And if it's at red, then everyone should be masking. I think what Dr. Walensky was saying, though, is it's not just COVID, right? So, COVID, we're still kind of in the green to yellow-ish, depending on where you are, but there's so much more flu. Like for the first time ever, we saw more flu in a given week than we saw COVID. And there's so much RSV and there's so much rhinovirus. So the COVID levels are kind of irrelevant at this point. But we know that all these other viruses are circulating, and wearing a mask when you're at the grocery store or, around people that you don't know, like it's pretty easy and cheap and reasonably effective. Does it prevent every infection? No, of course not, but it certainly reduces people's risk. So I think that's what she was trying to say is like, why not, if you have a tool to protect yourself, why not use it?
And certainly in addition to masking, everything we were doing to protect ourselves from COVID would, in theory, also protect us from flu and RSV and all those other respiratory illnesses, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's amazing how often we touch our face. Like, I think there've been studies that we touch our faces hundreds of times a day. So if your hands aren't clean, that's a really good way to give yourself a respiratory virus. So frequent hand washing, again, like when you're in situations where you can distance a little bit and not be, packed into a room together, like choose that option if that's available to you. And if you have to be close with people, wear your mask. And just be aware, like, and if you know that you're at higher risk, whether it's flu or RSV or COVID, then you probably want to be more careful right now, in terms of what events you choose to go to and how close you get to people. And obviously, of the 4 viruses we're talking about, 2 of them are vaccine preventable. So, making sure that you've gotten your flu shot. If you're an older adult, get one of those high dose or adjuvanted or, better flu shots, if it's available, which they are. And make sure you've gotten your fall booster for COVID. I mean, there's really no reason not to protect yourself in as many different ways as possible, because no one way is going to be perfect.
So what is your message to those who, I've never gotten the flu shot, I don't need one, or, I've gotten three COVID vaccines, I'm not doing the booster. What would you say to that group?
Well, I mean, I think people decline vaccines for different reasons. So, but I think the one that I think we can have the most impact on is people who just don't feel that they're at risk, and don't need it. So for flu, yes, flu tends to affect the very young and the very old, but often, certainly affects pregnant women more severely than non-pregnant women, and can affect otherwise healthy people. And you just never know ahead of time whether you're going to be one of those unlucky people. And even if you don't end up in the hospital, like you could feel pretty rotten for, at least a few days, if not a week or more. I've likened it to, feeling like you get run over by a truck, like you just ache all over, you have fevers. It's not a pleasant experience. So why have the risk of, missing work or school or whatever, even if you're not sick enough to go to the hospital? And then again, for COVID, I saw an analogy recently that it's like, some vaccines, like you get 1 or 2 doses and you're good for life, right? But many vaccines don't work that way. Obviously, flu vaccine doesn't work that way. Tetanus doesn't work that way. And certainly these COVID vaccines don't work that way. So it's almost like, if you had your phone and your battery's charged, obviously as you continue to use your phone, your battery's gonna go down. You're not gonna let your battery go down to 0 and not have your phone not work. So it's the same, like, it's like recharging your battery. So every time you get a booster, that kind of recharges your battery, recharges your immunity, keeps it as high as it possibly can be. And so you don't let that go down to 0 or less than 5%. And, the nice thing with these bivalent boosters is that they have the strain that's actually circulating now, whereas all the other boosters didn't. So I think, between the time that it's been since whenever your last shot was, and the fact that the new boosters have both strains, I think, it's certainly, really, really important to get that updated immunity, because you're probably not protected from the vaccine that you got 6 months or a year ago.
So when we talk about RSV, there is currently no vaccine for RSV. And we know, parents of young children are most terrified, I believe, of RSV because it really impacts those young kids. But really, we're all at risk for RSV.
So almost everybody, traditionally everybody gets RSV by the time they're 2 years old, right? So it's really the babies that are in their first year of life who get RSV that are at most at risk of being in the hospital. Some babies that have other underlying conditions in their second year. I think that's changed a little bit just because kids haven't been exposed to it in a couple of years. But typically, like once you get through those first couple of years, you might get RSV, and it doesn't feel any different to you than a regular cold. However, we start to see a peak again in older populations, especially starting at about age 60. Often people that have other underlying health conditions, heart disease, lung disease, et cetera, where they can get really sick from RSV and get in and be hospitalized. We have people in the ICU right now with RSV. So yeah, it's kind of that bimodal. So very young, very old, often with other health conditions, at least for the older population. The good news is that there are vaccines coming. They're under trial now, and there's also monoclonal antibodies that are designed for young kids that can help prevent. And those are all there's one available now, but there's another one coming that will be more broadly applicable. So hopefully those will get approved. But yeah, there'll be vaccines for older adults and eventually for pregnant women to protect the babies, and then also eventually for kids as well. So we're excited that a lot of activity is coming with RSV, but unfortunately it doesn't help us right now.
Yeah, I'm certainly looking forward to whenever that is, you and I sitting down and talking about that RSV vaccine. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So regardless of what illness you're battling right now, you feel like, as you said, you got kind of run over by a truck. Some people, anecdotally are saying they can't find, a lot of over-the-counter medications at Walgreens, Target, Acme, because so many people are looking for them. There's been a lot of conversation in the news about amoxicillin having a shortage. What is your message about those treatments and how maybe you can best treat yourself at home?
Yeah, so a lot of the Tylenol, the ibuprofen, those are symptomatic. They are there to make you feel better, but it's not like they're not absolutely essential. So I would just keep looking. I think it's sporadic when different stores have them in stock. The amoxicillin, the good thing is, all these viruses, they're viruses, so you don't need an antibiotic. Amoxicillin would not treat any of these viruses. So that, we tend to give that when we're not sure if it's bacterial or if we think it's bacterial. And certainly occasionally people will get a bacterial super infection on top of their virus, but that's more the exception than the rule. And there are other forms of amoxicillin available. It's really just the solution that's on shortage right now. But there's lots of non-medication things you can do to feel better. So there's humidifiers, for cough, you can use honey as long as the child's over 1 year old. There, just symptomatic things like that, I think, are things that should be more readily available.
Dr. Drees, before we let you go, what is your just key message about the Tripledemic right now?
I mean, I think it's, protect yourself in as many ways as possible. And I think, that's being up to date on vaccinations, it's wearing your mask, it's washing your hands, it's being, just being really socially aware of kind of what's going on right now and not putting yourself in risky situations. Everything's a risk benefit equation. So you may not want to miss a wedding, but, you might, defer going to the grocery store if you can. It's all, it's really just taking each situation, taking your own personal risk and evaluating each situation that you're putting yourself in.
Thank you so much. And if you're watching and have more questions for Dr. Drees, please put those in the comments. We can certainly chat with you after this live video. And please visit christianacare.org if you're looking for a location to get your flu vaccine or your COVID booster. We are always here to help. Thanks so much and stay safe this holiday season.